There's a clock in Tehran and a clock in Israel. And the question is which one is moving faster towards the end game? And the argument really is that, the Iranian position is much weaker. They have a much weaker economy. They don't have the sort of support that they thought they might get. They've believed a lot of their own bluster. And if you compare the Israeli attack with the Iranian attack on Israel and the Israeli attack on Iran, they're at a completely different level of sophistication. And I think they realize that the situation is not as good as they thought it would.
This is a conversation with Dr. Ali Ansari, a professor at St. Andrews University and an expert on Iranian history and its foreign policy. In this interview, we talk about Iran's conflict with Israel, why both countries race against the clock to win, how the past months changed the balance of power between the two countries, about the great paradox of Iran's foreign policy, and much more. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And this podcast is also supported by generous supporters on Patreon that you can join to get full ad-free episodes and a bunch of other perks. And now, enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the podcast.
You're very welcome.
So, since we're going to be talking about Iran and Iranian foreign policy, I think it makes sense to probably start with sort of an overall assessment of where we are at this point and how has Iranian situation and position changed after everything that's happened in the region and in its proxy conflict with Israel in recent weeks and months.
So I think the major change in Iran's foreign policy predates this current crisis by a couple of years. The most significant change in Iranian foreign policy, which has affected us to this day, was their decision after Russia's invasion of Ukraine to double down with Russia. And that basically overturned 200 years of Iranian foreign policy, which was in some ways to try and balance the various forces against it, to use the Russians against the West. It's obviously focused in terms of its own revolutionary ideology against the United States, to a lesser extent against Europe. But by doubling down with Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, it basically alienated a major part of its foreign policy plank, which is Europe, because it's always liked to use Europe as a ballast against the United States to try and. So you have this really bizarre situation at the moment, for instance, that in the current crisis that they're finding themselves in, you're getting a lot of nice words from Pezeshkian, the current president, but also, interestingly, Ali Akbar Velayati, who is the Supreme Leader's advisor on foreign affairs, or one of them anyway. And he said that, Iran is very open to good relations with some Western powers. But the real problem is at the moment is whether Western powers are really interested in good relations with Iran because of the wider political framework. So the dynamic has changed. And of course, this decision in 2022 to side with Russia also meant that the JCPOA was basically dead and buried. I think there was a small chance that it would be resuscitated then, but the Iranians decided not to. And of course, has fed into all sorts of other problems that now Iran, it was very interesting that in the aftermath of the Israeli attack on Iran, an Iranian journalist very angrily said to the foreign minister, they said, where is this dishonorable, he called him, where is this dishonorable Vladimir Putin when we needed him? When he needs drones, we send him drones. When we need his help, where is the S-400 anti-aircraft missile defense? Where are the fancy jets? And of course, unsurprisingly, Putin hasn't sent any of this because he needs them himself. So he doesn't, So there's a sort of a feeling that Iran has doubled down on an alliance that is has costed a lot but delivered very little.
What was Iran's original calculation when it made that decision? I guess what prompted it to completely give up on Europe in exchange for fully aligning with Russia?
Iran had a very hardline government at the time. And the hardliners were very much in the driving seat. But, they basically reflected what the Supreme Leader wanted. And their belief was that Putin would win the war in Ukraine very quickly. He'd be in Kiev. And then Iran's negotiating position would be even stronger. I mean, that's what the Russians said. They said, you stick with us and your negotiating position afterwards will be because we will deal a death blow to the West. And, of course, the Europeans were saying to the Iranians, don't do this. Don't fall for this. It's not going to happen. But the Iranians decided to believe the Russians, and we are where we are. That was the calculation. It was a very, very bad piece of opportunism.
Do you think there's a chance that they might try to backtrack on this decision once again and sort of rebalance the situation and their foreign policy?
I think some of them are thinking about it. And I think that there is a genuine desire on some parts, but of course they have to change certain things. One of the ways of doing that would be to pull away from the Russian alliance, which they're not prepared to do at the moment. The other way to do it is to release all these dual nationals that they have arrested, all these European dual national Iranian. And of course, they just executed one other guy, a German Iranian. So, what they're doing is, my understanding anyway, is that a lot of the Europeans are very fed up with this. And unless Iran makes a very, very concrete gesture, nothing will happen. Nothing will happen. And I don't think domestically they're up to it yet. I think they know what needs to be done, but I don't think they have the political will or political capacity, isn't there?
I want to maybe move more towards the present and what happened especially with Israel in the past weeks and months. If we look specifically at that development, to sort of get back to my original question, how do you think that changed Iranians' position?
Well, if we went into the summer, you went into the summer with the Israelis probably in more of a military quagmire, which I think they still are pretty much lodged into a sort of a long-scale military operation and conflict. But I think the view when we were going into the summer was that in some ways Iran still had a whip hand, so to speak, in the existence of Hezbollah. Over the summer, the Israelis have used their extraordinary powers of intelligence gathering and their ability to penetrate the Iranian and Hezbollah establishment to completely transform their situation. So not only did they assassinate Hania in Tehran, very bold assassination, they then completely decapitated Hezbollah's leadership, not just Nasrallah, but also a whole range of their middle range management, so to speak. They've now killed, obviously, Sinwar in Gaza. The problem the Iranians have is they're finding that their options for dealing with Israel as they see it are becoming more and more constrained. They always used to work on the argument that we have Hezbollah and Hezbollah is our deterrence against Israel. Hezbollah is now on the back foot. It's not finished, but it's on the back foot. Hamas is clearly on the back foot. The question really for us observing this is to how much political capacity Israel has left and how far it can go before it also has to start really genuinely thinking about a political settlement. And I know there are obviously many people in Israel itself who think that, you cannot go on just like this. I mean, you have to have some sort of political solution at the end of it. But from an Iranian perspective, of course, the Iranians are going to try and see if they can sit out the Israelis. But there are two clocks. There's a clock in Tehran and a clock in Israel. And the question is which one is moving faster towards the end game? And the argument really is that, the Iranian position is much weaker. They have a much weaker economy. They don't have the sort of support that they thought they might get. They've believed a lot of their own bluster. I mean, if you compare the Israeli attack with the Iranian attack on Israel and the Israeli attack on Iran, they're at a completely different level of sophistication. That's not to say that the Iranian one was not more showy in some ways and all these sort of missiles raining down. But the fact is, in terms of technology, the Israelis are leaps ahead, really, of the Iranians, and that they were able to get into Iranian airspace and to cause the damage they did, using long-range air. Remember, these F-35s have a range, I think, of 1,300 kilometers. So they would have needed, obviously, air refueling to get in. And if you look at the background of what they're saying the Israelis did, what they basically did is they tested Iran's air defense system and they found it was weak. That's basically what it is. They didn't do much else, I have to say. I mean, they hit a few, missile bases and the sort of missile production, which I think we will see the consequences in the next few months. But actually, this attack was much more of a signal, in a sense, to the Iranians than a show. They weren't going out to kill a lot of people or whatever, which thank God they weren't. But what they were trying to show to the Iranians is you're vulnerable. We can get you. And I think it's caused the Iranians to think a bit. If you look at Khamenei's response recently, he said, we mustn't exaggerate the attack, but we mustn't diminish it either. I mean, it's a very waffly answer, but it was interesting because it wasn't a jingoistic answer. It was basically, we need to think about this very carefully. And I think they realized that the situation is not as good as they thought it was for them.
I think that he also said that there needs to be a response, but it's not going to be him who's going to decide on what the response will be. So sort of pushing away the responsibility.
Yeah. And also, I mean, what they've said is we reserve the right for a response, but, whatever. I mean, whatever, that's fine. But I think the problem they have is this, that they have spent all their time saying that the Israeli attack was completely inconsequential. Yeah. So they've said, I don't know. So it's very difficult for them to justify launching another set of missiles because they must know that if they launch another set of missiles against Israel, the next time, the American election will be over, by the way, the next time the Israelis, probably with American backing, will go full in. But, everyone's very cagey about it, very, very naturally so, because, someone said to me, what if Israel had attacked the infrastructure, the economic, the oil stuff? And I said, I don't think the Israelis were ever interested in doing this because the Israelis have a notion that they want to go for the regime. They don't want to go for the people. They don't want to make life harder for the people. They want, or they certainly don't want to be blamed for it. Remember that. On the other hand, I said, if the Israelis had gone for Iran's oil facilities, it would have been very easy for them to go for that. But the chances are the Iranians would have then attacked the oil facilities of the UAE and the Saudis and others as sort of retaliation, which, by the way, itself shows you how limited their options are. They can't attack Israel again, so they're going to attack someone else. What they're basically saying is we'll go down, but we'll take everyone with us. And of course, I don't think the US or anyone really heading into a US election is really ready for that at the moment.
Well, you've mentioned there's a clock in Israel and clock in Tehran. I understand what the clock in Israel looks like, where you basically have to, or the leadership has to consider the public opinion because it will face elections eventually. But in Iran, that's probably not really that much of a consideration. And you've mentioned the economy, but Iranian economy has been doing pretty badly for quite a few years. So what's the clock? What's the clock there?
I think the clock in Iran is the economy. And it has been doing very badly for a number of years. But if you look at the signals coming out of Iran, so for instance, this year was, I think, one of the first years where they were unable to supply electricity to all the cities, continuously over summer. I mean, it wasn't just short power cuts. These were major, serious power cuts. They are finding it difficult to supply water. Now, if you look at the assessments by Iranian economists and stuff, they say the government, by the way, not the regime itself has probably got quite a bit of money, but the government, in terms of paying salaries, pensions, this, that, and the other, is running out of money. And Pezeshkian made a wonderful comment where he said, our economy, in order to stay afloat, requires $200 billion worth of investment. We have $100 billion, but we need another $100 billion from everyone else. And I mean, where is that going to come from? I mean, and I have to tell you, this is a very conservative estimate of what the Iranian economy wants. So it's true that the Iranian economy is doing very badly for a long time and it can sustain it. But as any social scientist historian knows, there is always a crunch time. There is always a crunch time. I mean, eventually the critical mass will form. The question for you and I and others, of course, is to try and assess when this critical mass will be. And will the Iranians have it? The problem is, I think, that if you look at the attitude of the Iranians within Iran to the regime, they are so unhappy with the regime that the general view is it would not take much for another round of protests to emerge. It would not take much. And most people are expecting it, to be honest, that it will come. And I think the catalyst will be economic. But let's say, for the sake of argument, the Israelis do launch a wider attack on Iranian infrastructure, then that will hasten the problem. But of course, the fallout of that is much more dramatic. And people, again, would rather any collapse or something, or any economic sort of deterioration occurs internally in their own time, rather than do it tomorrow. It doesn't matter if it happens in 2 years' time. Let it happen in 2 years' time.
So in other words, if I understand it correctly, the economic clock isn't necessarily tied to the conflict with Israel. It will still keep ticking even when there's not one.
Yes. I mean, when I talk about the clock, by the way, you're quite right to say the clock in Israel is about public opinion, whatever. And that's what we're talking about. But the Iranians are not talking about that. They're thinking about the Israeli clock is the collapse of the regime. So, because the Iranians are going to saying this, Israel is on the verge of collapse. It's finished. People are fleeing, all this. So, in a sense, we have the Iranians think the Israelis will collapse tomorrow. The Israelis think the Iranians will collapse tomorrow. Neither are going to collapse tomorrow. But if I had put money on it, I think the Israelis will be there longer than the Iranians, for the simple reason that you said that the Israelis can change their government, the Iranians can't. So, you see what I mean? There's a problem there. But it's interesting that when you talk about the clock, I think you're absolutely right. But that's not the way the Iranians are looking at it. They're not saying, oh, the Iranians, for them, Netanyahu being replaced by Olmert is neither here nor there.
Just a quick break here. In the coming months, I will be starting a newsletter focused on what you need to know and what you might have missed in geopolitics. It's completely free and you can already sign up for it, and it would be quite helpful if you do that. You can find the link for the sign up in the description below. And now, back to the conversation. There has been always, basically since October 7th, there's been a lot of speculation and fears about this turning into a larger regional war. And so far, it seems to me, I don't know if you read it the same way, but it seems to me that Iran is actually doing everything it can to avoid that war. And that looking at Iran and Israel, it's actually maybe Israel, or at least Netanyahu, who wouldn't mind maybe such a war to occur. I don't know if you would agree with that, but do you think that it's because of the clock that Iran is actually trying to avoid this larger regional conflict?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think also the thing is that Netanyahu himself probably doesn't want a major regional war either, but he's more confident, I think, and more gung-ho in his own mind that if it happened, he can handle it. Okay? Because he's got America on his side, of course. I mean, if anything happens, America will come to Israel. Iran has nothing. I mean, the Russians aren't going to come to Iran's help, right? I mean, so I think because of the so say if for the sake of argument we're talking about Iran 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I think Iran would be much more robust now. It would say, we have the people with us, we're going to take the fight in, whatever that means, and we're going to do it. But I think now they're much, much more uncertain, and that's precisely why I agree with you. I mean, I think they really want to avoid a major conflict because I don't think they can support it. In some ways, it will be like the Russians in the First World War. I mean, this is the thing. Will the states survive a major conflict? There might be a short-term rally around the flag, by the way. There might be, but I don't think, it's very interesting. All the jingoism that's going on the social medias from Iranians in the diaspora. Yeah. All the nationalism. I don't see that much nationalist sort of triumphalism coming out of Iran, by the way, apart from official, I don't see it. You have a situation where, I was saying to someone that after the Israeli attack, the IRGC typically put out a notice saying anyone who reveals the location of any explosions or lauds the Israeli attack will get a 10-year prison sentence. Now, on one level, this makes a lot of sense. You don't want your enemy to know exactly what they've hit or what they've done or whatever. Of course you do. But to sort of say it in quite that way, to say if you do it, you're going to get a 10-year prison sentence, suggests maybe that they're not entirely certain about what people are doing. And by the way, everyone has ignored it. All these videos are going up, so it's not time.
Do you think that I think there's a bit of a paradox in Iranian foreign policy that on
not just one paradox, Dominic, not just one.
It's one large paradox.
I know.
But one of them that I find really interesting is that on one hand, they're really trying to avoid a larger war because they probably feel they can't afford it. But at the same time, they have this very aggressive foreign policy of trying to stir unrest in the region and using all their proxy groups to spread chaos. Isn't it? It would seem to me that actually this foreign policy is maybe not playing in favor of the regime and its long-term sustainability and resilience. Do you think that they might come to an idea that it's actually harming the regime itself and that they would need to reconsider what kind of a role and how?
Well, ultimately, I think you're right. But you see, the problem, the tension in Iran, the contradiction in it, is between the republic and the revolution. So one side says there's the state, which is the republic, which has, the Iranian foreign minister going around all these capitals and talking, and it's very normal. Then you have the revolution, and the revolution is a completely different beast. And the question is, which one is in the driving seat? Is it the republic or is it the revolution? And the sad fact is, for the last 20 years, it's the revolution. That's dominant, and that's the problem. And now I think you put your nail, you put your, you put your finger on it, if I can do that. And that is that there is this tension. It's quite contradictory. It's, in my view, very destructive for Iran, for the state, let alone the Islamic Republic. And it's basically putting the priorities of the revolution ahead of the republic. There is no sensible national interest reason for the Iranians to be so involved in the Israeli-Arab conflict. It is a purely revolutionary ideology. Even as good Muslims, they don't need to go as far as they've gone. As good Muslims, they can do what the Saudis have done. As the other, they can say, we don't like what Israel, we're not doing it. But that doesn't mean you actively participate or try to destroy another state. Yeah? This is the problem. The revolutionary purity demands from them that they do something about it. And this has been in the last 6 months the great paradox, which is why, in April, they launched that attack, that missile attack on Israel. Why? Because a lot of their proxies in the region were saying, what the hell are you doing? Where are you? Why haven't you've been shouting death to Israel for 40 years. Now you have the opportunity and you're sitting back. And so they felt obliged to do something, but they were not happy to do it because they don't like to be there in the front, because they know also at the end of the day that what Israel has forced them to do is to come out from behind the parapet. The real difference now, and it really happened at when the Iranians did the last attack back in the early October, it was very emphatically clear from now on, and this is what this Israeli counterattack has shown, that we're no longer playing with the fiction that this is a proxy war, or that the Iranians and the Israelis are adhering to certain rules, that they don't attack each other directly, they just attack each other through proxies, which is what it's been doing. Now, basically, that taboo has been shattered, and the Iranians can no longer hide behind plausible deniability. So it's obviously something that's taking them quite a bit of a long time to learn. But for instance, recently, after the Israeli attack, they have suddenly gone out and said, this is an infringement of our sovereignty against all international law and this and that. What were you doing when you launched 180 missiles against Israel? I mean, that sort of rhetoric only works if, for instance, they could say that, these attacks that were going on Israel were not by us. They were, the Houthis did it, or Hezbollah, we're not in control, they don't listen. But now they can't do that anymore. You cannot say that you are not involved. And all these people that talk about the other thing that I find a bit baffling, they say, we're all very worried about an all-out war. Well, in some ways, we are at that stage already. They are at war. They don't have any illusions about it. They haven't declared war. But, I mean, bloody hell, they're firing missiles at each other and destroying. I mean, what else do you want to say? It's just a limited war. It's not a total war. It's a limited war. But they are at war. And when people say, we're very worried about an all-out war in the Middle East, what do they mean by that? I mean, Israel and Iran can't invade each other. I mean, they're not next-door neighbors. I mean, what they're doing is what they can do, which is to attack each other from the air and the sea. So it's limited, but it's there.
That's also always been one of my questions when people talk about this possibility of regional war, is that geographically the two countries are very distant. So
I know. What do they mean? I mean, to be honest, I'll be honest with you, Dominic, I find some of the journalistic coverage of all this has been fairly simplistic. I mean, I sort of think that journalists sort of ask these questions without thinking through what they're asking. They're constantly saying, for instance, that we're very, Iran is, I mean, there's an assumption among some journalists that Iran is a regional superpower. It quite clearly isn't. I mean, even they probably realize they're not a regional superpower. Yes, they have a lot of missiles, but these missiles aren't very accurate. And yes, they can do damage. I mean, let's not have any, you can do a lot of damage with very basic weapons. I mean, a terrorist attack can do a lot of damage, right? I mean, 9/11 did a lot of damage, but it's not, you don't need to be a superpower to do that. But I think in the grand scheme of things, their technological capability is well below. One of the things I was asking a friend of mine, and I said, I mean, unless you believe there's some British writer has said that the Israelis never attacked Iran or whatever. I don't know why he comes to this. Apparently, he thinks that they were so scared of Iranian anti-aircraft missiles that they moved away. Assuming that's nonsense, and the Israelis did go in. one of the things that I was very curious about, and I said to someone, I said, where was the Iranian Air Force? Why didn't they go up and do, they were obviously warned of the attack. The Russians gave them warning. So you'd think that the Iranian Air Force would be up there doing patrols. Well, I think it's obvious where they were. They were fairly well nicely tucked away because they're not going to compete with F-35s. The F-35, I think what the Israelis did on this round actually is that it was very much a practice run. They tested Iran's weapon systems. They knocked out a few of them. They knocked out a few factories. But they also reported back to the Americans that the F-35 works very well. Thank you very much. Because the Americans have never had experience of the F-35 in combat. So this was test. So the British and all the others who have the F-35 will be saying, how did it perform? And they go, very well. And it's interesting. I mean, how it was all run.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. It seems to me, listening to you, that one of the big implications of everything that's happened in the past few weeks is that Iran's real capabilities were exposed as opposed to maybe what people would assume they were previously. And I guess that can have a lot of implications both domestically and externally.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think the problem is that they expose them. So when the first attack happened in April, they sent these drones across the Jordanian desert, right, going in. And I remember talking to them, I said, who sends a drone at 120 kilometers an hour? Anyway, a lot of these drones were knocked out. And obviously this time round, they changed it. They just had missiles, which makes a lot more sense from their point of view. But the interesting thing is that every time this happens, pro-regime apologists, basically, and supporters say, but this is just a fraction of what we have. We have much more powerful weapons that we will use next time, whatever. And then they will say, that's fine. I mean, this is all part of grey propaganda, and But the truth of the matter is, what people, I think, analysts much better than me, I have to say, and military analysts are concluding, is that their assessment of Iranian missile technology, as well as air defense technology, is not as good as they thought it was. That there's a lot of bravado has been going on here, and that the Iranians themselves have believed some of it. They said, for instance, that we have hypersonic missiles. First of all, you don't need hypersonic missiles. I mean, the missiles they were sending are supersonic is fast enough, by the way. They will get through. Some of them will get through. But hypersonic missiles, as far as I'm aware, only 3 countries in the world have them. China, Russia, and America. Most European countries don't have them. We're developing them. But the point is unless you believe that the Russians have given the Iranians hypersonic missiles, and I'm not sure they have, how many would they have anyway? I mean, the Iranian arsenal is maybe 4,000 strong. Yes, there's plenty more to do. But if the Israelis have knocked out their production facilities, they won't be able to replenish them. But the other thing is, of course, is to replenish them costs money. And the Iranians don't have that sort of money, really. Well, let me qualify that. They do, but at the cost of everything else not being funded, you know what I mean?
I want to talk about Hezbollah as well and sort of the implications for it. But I think one of the first questions maybe on that topic was to follow up on something that you've mentioned, is that Hezbollah maybe expected Iran to come and help them in the time of need, and they didn't. So how is that going to change their relations and sort of Iran's position maybe in Lebanon?
Well, I mean, I think, again, you've hit on a very good point here, that what's happened is a lot of the proxies are saying, why haven't you come to our assistance when we asked you for it? And I think it will change the nature of the relationship. I think undoubtedly it will change the nature of the relationship. That people are saying that a lot of this is bombast. So let me give you the more specific example, the pages. Where did the pages come from? The pages were delivered to Hezbollah by an Iranian company. I mean, it was an Iranian company nominated by the IRGC. The Iranians admitted it. It's on Iranian television. They said, yeah, one of our companies, because it's not normal for, they said it's because Hezbollah can't obviously buy things online, obviously. An Iranian company was nominated and the IRGC, and we bought it from Taiwan and this. But I think there are many people in Hezbollah are going to say, Didn't you check these pages before you send them to us? And of course, the Iranians have admitted it. They said we never did any due diligence. We never checked them. Now, the other argument, of course, is that it wasn't just, I know the conspiracy theories, is that it's not that you shouldn't just check them, that the Iranians had deliberately sabotaged it, or Mossad agents within the Iranian intelligence, had sort of done this. Who knows? I mean, the politics of the Middle East can be so perverse. I have to tell you that it's very, sometimes you come out with the most bizarre development. Who knows?
What do you think it changes for Hezbollah within Lebanon? Do you think that it could maybe change sort of its influence in the country? Because Hezbollah just maybe.
I think so. I think the pro-Hezbollah. See, I'm less sanguine than a lot of people, saying that Hamas and Hezbollah will survive and there's no military solution. All this. I mean, on one level, it's true. There is no military solution to this problem in the Palestinians and Lebanon. But that doesn't mean the political solution has to include Hezbollah. Do you see what I mean? I mean, Hezbollah could be a much diminished force. And I suspect there will be many Lebanese people who will be very happy by the fact that Hezbollah is a much diminished force within the region. Why? Because Hezbollah basically has turned into a vast sort of mafia organization. I mean, we give it all these virtues by saying it's a welfare, offers welfare, it offers this, it's a political, a social, as well as a military. But at the end of the day, like a lot of these groups, a lot of these great sort of terrorist groups, they run social and political operations in order to support their military and ideological aims. And these are basically mafia extensions. I mean, look at Sinwar in Gaza. Sinwar was basically anyone who opposed his rule in Gaza was basically nobbled by Sinwar. He was the guy who'd go in there and basically, and very brutally kill people. I mean, this was a question of, now people say, but this is a matter of resistance, and the resistance against Israel, all sorts of things are permissible. I disagree, actually. I mean, I disagree very strongly. I mean, I think this is a classic revolutionary anarchist sort of type of model of, because the evil is so great, we can do whatever it takes to get there. I think what this sort of behavior does is it corrupts you. It corrupts you in a moral sense. And I think this is what's happened. I mean, now, whether the Israelis have encouraged this or not is another matter. But the fact is, people with individual agency and individual responsibility, certainly for Hezbollah, what they've done is they've turned into a sort of a state within a state and a sort of a mafia within a state. And for the Lebanese government, it's extremely difficult. I mean, it's extremely difficult to get any solution with Hezbollah, in a powerful position. So they're probably privately quite grateful that Hezbollah will be diminished.
You've mentioned that, I don't know exactly the term that you used, but you've mentioned that Hezbollah is now hugely weakened after all the attacks that Israel carried out against its leadership and against its members. But at least in fighting against the IDF in southern Lebanon, it seems that at least the military wing of Hezbollah is still sort of remains a somewhat competent fighting force, at least based on the reporting and also the number of casualties that the IDF reports from Lebanon.
I mean, the question is and I don't doubt, by the way, that the Hezbollah still has this vast tunnel complex and whatever. But I suspect it's not as coherent a force as it might have been. And obviously, we're in the early days of the fight with Hezbollah. One of the problems with all this, I've got to be honest with you, is that we are all living within a fog of war type thing. So we all see what the journalists report now. A proper assessment of what this means in the longer term will not be able to be made for some time. So I would be very cautious about saying that Hezbollah is still, in fighting shape. I think there's still a problem, for the IDF. I mean, clearly they are. There's that. But the question is how long they can sustain themselves and how long they can keep going. And the leadership is in disarray, and also their command and control is in disarray. So it may be that as individual pockets, as they would work, a good sort of like guerrilla fighting would work in individual pockets and still cause a lot of problems. But there will come a time when their capacity for action begins to diminish. The question is whether the Israeli capacity for action will diminish before Hezbollah's. But at the moment, the the damage that has been done over the last couple of months has been, in my view, pretty significant. And how long they can sustain it is a moot question. I don't know. We'll be able to see. If we come back in 6 months' time and they're still fighting, then yes, I would agree with you that it hasn't achieved as much as we thought. But I suspect it won't go on for that long. There's a hostage to fortune for you, but I suspect that.
And how long Hezbollah will be able to recover from those attacks is also, I guess, another question that's part of it.
I mean, our problem is that, I suppose even in Gaza and the tragedy that's unfolded in Gaza, I mean, clearly the way the Israelis are looking at this is as an existential conflict. And that gives them, in their own mind, the justification to do a whole lot of damage. I mean, that's the way they're looking at it. I can't see, in just physical terms, that Hamas will be able to come back from this in the short to medium term in any semblance of what it had. I mean, basically, let's be honest, the Israelis have flattened Gaza, and that's what they've done. They've flattened it. So any recovery for Gaza will not be predicated on any inclusion of Hamas. There is no political solution to Gaza, as far as I can see, that includes Hamas. And that's the issue. And it's also with Hezbollah. Hezbollah have already offered, for instance, to move up from the Litani River. It's the Israelis who are in some ways not taking the offer at the moment. Whether Hezbollah are serious, I don't know. But there have been voices. There have been voices in the other. There will come a stage when, in my view, the Israelis are basically looking at the fact that they will come to the negotiating table when they can be assured that neither Hezbollah or Hamas will be at that table. Yeah. Now, I have to say, it's a grim prospect, I have to say, for Lebanon and Gaza. It is a grim prospect. The interesting thing is that when you talk to the Arab states and when you look at the Saudis, the UAE and others, they are also looking at a post-Gaza reconstruction without Hamas. Yeah, they're not shedding any tears for Hamas. So, there is an issue here of how long can the Israelis sustain this, and how long are they going. The irony and the tragic irony in some ways is that many of the Arab states are behind them in the destruction of Hamas and Hezbollah, and then they are looking for the post-Hamas Hezbollah settlement. So, a sort of the question mark in some ways for us when you're asking, Hezbollah is still fighting. It may still have the military capacity to fight. Will it have the political will to fight? Let's see. And let's see if they come to some sort of compromise.
I guess maybe in talking about Hezbollah, it maybe is a little similar to the war in 2006 when Israel also invaded Lebanon, and it wasn't able to, probably wasn't even trying to, but it wasn't able to destroy Hezbollah. So it will not be able to do that again in Lebanon. Also because unlike in Gaza, where it's occupying the entire territory, in Lebanon, there's a lot of areas that Hezbollah can move to away from the south.
Although I have to say, the Israelis are not, I don't know if you heard, but there was a Christian village that was bombed in northern Lebanon. And I understand the reason the Israelis bombed it is because the Christians were giving shelter to Hezbollah. So they went after it very ruthlessly, I have to say. I mean, the Christians have nothing to do with it, right? And I always wondered, why on earth are they bombing Christians? I mean, what's that about? It's because the Christians were providing shelter to Hezbollah, so they're going after them. I think there are differences. I think the danger we have to be careful about, and this is a thing I also would always caution myself, we can't fight the last war. And everyone thinks to 2006 and assumes that it will be repeated again. I think there are some differences between now and 2006. One is the determination of the Israelis, who see this as an existential threat, and Netanyahu clearly, either for personal reasons, because he doesn't want to go to prison, or ideological, whatever, is determined to see this through. Secondly, I think the Israelis have been planning for this for a very long time. The Israelis came away from 2006 very, very, taught a lesson in a way, that it's not going to be easy. They thought we can bomb a few places, march and they'll be fine. They discovered that it wasn't going to be that easy. So this time they're probably better prepared. The third thing which I would caution you is that Hezbollah, of course, from Hezbollah in 2006 were the heroes of the Arab world. I mean, I remember it very well. The heroes of the Arab world. after the Arab Spring, of course, it was Hezbollah that was used to crush the Syrian uprising in Syria. And Hezbollah were very, very intimately involved in that suppression. And as a consequence of that, Hezbollah's image in the Arab world has changed 180 degrees. Okay? So we're dealing with a different framework. That's all I'm saying. And why I think that whereas in 2006, Hezbollah had presented itself as the champions of Arab liberation, not just Shia or whatever, Arab liberation. In 2024, they can't do that anymore. And it's why when Hezbollah and Nasrallah was killed, one of the biggest cheerleaders of all this were Syrians. Were sort of cheering the demise of Nasrallah. I mean, they genuinely didn't like them. And I think if you go around the Arab world, there's very, very little love lost for Hezbollah. They think Hezbollah is basically an Iranian proxy, and it's a proxy there to support Iranian power, and they don't. So that's why I think that we just have to be careful. I'm not underestimating, by the way, the challenge. I entirely agree with you on that. But I think we have to be careful not to read in. Everyone says to me, but they didn't do it beforehand. Oh, they didn't do this. That's obviously fine. I entirely understand that. But the situation may be different now. And I'll give you another example. Israel and Iran, for instance. The Iranians have long estimated in their own mind, that they can sustain an Israeli attack. Okay? They don't want a war with America, but they can cope with Israel. And I used to say this in meetings all that. I said, don't worry. The Iranians have put it in their calculations that an Israeli attack they can cope with. And if a few people die, great, they become martyrs and everyone can join. It'll be quite useful. The dislike of Israel is great enough that people will do that. But of course, when I was saying this was like 15 years ago. Okay. And if you look at it now, what's interesting is that actually support for Israel among the Iranian population has seen a sea change, absolute sea change. There isn't any great support for Palestinians among Iranians anymore. You can't get them out to demonstrate in favor of the Palestinians. Yeah. But also Israeli capacity and capability has grown. Yeah. So this is the test of this attack. Previously, the general assumption was that the Israelis do not have the range in which to attack Iran with their aircraft. The only way that it could be done was with the Americans. And that the strategy of the Israelis was to get the Americans involved. And the Americans would send a couple of aircraft carriers up the Indian Ocean, and that would be it, right? So a couple of aircraft carriers would give you about 600 aircraft or whatever, more than enough to deal with. What we've seen today, however, is that the Israelis are capable on their own of launching a long-range airstrike on Iran. And that tells me that their capabilities have improved. They have air refueling capability. They have the missile technology. The F-35s have the range to do it. So I think these things have changed. So the idea, this is what I was saying about, I said, the Iranians are constantly refighting the Iran-Iraq war. They think they're dealing with Saddam Hussein. I used to say that. I said, don't have these illusions. Saddam Hussein had a few Scuds and some old MiG jets, that he was flying over. You're underestimating the quality of Western military technology in incompetent hands.
Aren't Israelis also facing the same limitations as the Iranians, that even though they can reach Iran, there's limit in how much damage they can do, because they can bomb a few facilities, but that's not really going to damage the regime or its armed forces. Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.